Or good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with our webinar on running shoes. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Robert O. I am a sports medicine family physician. I currently work at the Office of Surgeon General for the Army, but I do get to play a little bit at Fort Belvoir doing sports medicine and family medicine. So we're going to go ahead and get started, but before we do, we have a long list of disclaimers to start off and kick this off. I just want to let you know that I have no conflict of interest. The only conflict of interest is that I do wear running shoes and I do run. Okay? Alright, we're going to get started. So one of the classic moments of barefoot running was Abebe Bikila, who won the 1960 Olympics barefoot. So let's fast forward to 2011 in Boston. This barefoot caveman dubbed Glenn Rains crosses the 2011 Boston Marathon barefoot and almost naked. So here's objectives for our talk this morning/afternoon. We're going to dissect, look at running shoes and really learn about different shoe types. We're going to also look at the research on if and how shoes can prevent injury. We're also going to really explore the whole explosion of these minimalist shoes trend and really try to understand the concept of what minimalist shoes are trying to do. And finally, we're going to just touch a little bit on gait retraining and how we can use gait retraining in primary care. So let's start off with a case. This is a 28-year-old female with some shoe questions. She's really interested in your advice on running shoes. She's interested in running after her first 10K race. She typically does about 3 to 5 miles a week, but really would like to just be more consistent and able to finish that race. This is her first 10K race. We're also going to take a look at this 28-year-old with patellofemoral knee pain. Now that's a very common knee pain that we see in the military. This 28-year-old female, she's an avid runner. She's had some chronic knee pain for about a couple of years, has been enrolled in physical therapy and, quote, graduated, quote, end quote, physical therapy. She started running again after being graduated from physical therapy, and then she had some similar pain after running 3 miles. She is training for the Marine Corps Marathon. Alright, so before we dive into these cases, we need to know about shoes and what's in a shoe's name and different types of shoes. So we're going to talk about the traditional shoes first, then we're going to talk a little bit about the minimalist shoes, and then finally go into the transitional shoe. The traditional running shoes has 3 main parts. The upper here is where the foot is housed and where you put your foot into the shoe itself. And that is glued on to usually a midsole. And the midsole consists of all that fancy equipment that shoe companies try to sell you with, like shocks, like air, like gel, all those fancy things that is involved in the mid shoe. And can also provide some support too. And then finally, the outer is here, and you can see here is basically the treads of the shoe, and again, it's just glued on to the midsole. Taking a bit further into the shoe, now in the midsole itself, this is where all the cushioning appears in a traditional shoe, but like I said before, there are some additional support that is added into here. For oftentimes they would add a heel lift to have a little heel to toe differential, and we'll talk a lot more about that. They often sometimes on the inside will put a medial post to help try to control pronation. And as you can see here, the insole is kind of that flimsy kind of piece of device that you see inside the shoe outer to kind of give you a little bit of cushioning and maybe a little bit of arch support here with the insole. And that's often what we replace when we do custom orthotics or even over-the-counter orthotics. Now, also part of the shoe is this thing called a heel counter, and as you can see, it's a little stiffer, and it depends on the flexibility and stiffness of this heel counter. This heel counter provides that added stability and heel control to decrease the movement of the heel while running. So let's look at the traditional shoe itself and what we've designed to do, and what the shoe companies tell you is that these shoes are designed to be really customized, quote, to your foot. The theory goes that if the shoe can be designed for a common foot type, because these foot types have similar needs for support and cushioning. So that goes the theory. So let's talk about typical shoes and shoe types. So for the flat-footed individual in 1, and this is just the imprint of the foot, they recommend a motion control shoe, which will add a lot of medial support with a medial post and maybe a stiffer heel counter to control that pronation, that dreaded pronation that we think is bad. All right, for the high-heeled, or actually for the normal arch individual in like number 2, we generally recommend stability type shoes, which really has a balance of both cushioning and support, and it's kind of balanced throughout the shoe. And then finally, for those with high arches, the cushioned shoe has a lot more cushioning to help support the shoe, foot type itself. Okay, so those are the typical standard when you walk into a shoe store about motion control, stability, and cushioned. So let's now look at a classic shoe. This is really the first running shoe that got Nike off the ground. As you can see here, and this is called the Nike Cortez. As you can see here, this little gray area right there provides a little bit of heel lift. That's right in the midsole, this gray area here. This added a lift to this heel, and it was designed kind of to propel the runner forward. So as you can see, there is a higher height of the shoe at the heel side here versus the forefoot. And this is very common in the current traditional shoe that we see today. Let's take a look at heel lifts, and this is a cross section of a shoe. As you can see, this is the parallel line here, and as you can see here, even with the insole maybe the same height, they're adding a heel to toe differential that you can see from heel all the way to the toe. Okay, so that's called the heel lift that is traditionally found in the shoe itself. So while a shoe may not tell you exactly the heel to forefoot differential, you could actually estimate it pretty easily, and you do have to get a ruler. But if you wanted to do it, some shoe companies will tell you right off the bat what the heel to toe differential is, but sometimes they won't. They're just not going to tell you, and they may say this is like a minimalist shoe. But anyway, let's take a look into it. So this is called the heel to toe drop. Although it's not technically the toes, it's technically the forefoot, but this is what traditionally in the lay literature and what we see on the internet of what they call it, the heel to toe drop. So if you can see, the heel to toe drop is measured by measuring the height of the stack. The stack, now let's think about this. The stack is basically the outer tread plus the midsole. So you measure that at the heel through right here. So that's the stack height at the heel. Then you measure the stack height at the forefoot area where forefoot striking normally occurs. And this, you measure the stack height here in millimeters. Okay? So for example, if the stack height at the heel is 25 millimeters, and then the forefoot or toe area is 10 millimeter, you subtract those two together, which equals 15 millimeters. So this would be a shoe that has a 15 millimeter heel to toe drop or differential. And that's pretty typical in a typical shoe, a traditional shoe. Anywhere from 13 to 15 to 17 millimeter is kind of the typical range of the heel lift that you would have. Now non-traditional shoes, like more minimalist shoes, have a really lower drop, and that typically ranges from 0 to 4. And that is why it's often called zero drop shoes, if you heard that vernacular before. So this is this is a type of minimalist type shoe. So if you can look at this example here, the heel stack height is 24 millimeters, and then if you look at the toe stack height is 20 millimeters. And so if you take the 24 minus 20 is equals to 4 millimeter. So that is a heel to toe drop of about 4 millimeters, which is pretty typical in these new minimalist type shoes. Okay, so let's take a look at zero drop shoes. So I'm going to show you the first ever born zero drop shoe. Here it is. Ta-da! I guess it's kind of hard to do these webinars because I can't tell if you're laughing or not, but I'm going to assume my joke went over very well. So as you can see, the heel and the forefoot are parallel to the ground. I don't know how they sewed that Nike thing into his foot, but that sounded pretty painful. But anyway, all kidding aside, let's talk now about minimalist shoes. But before we talk about minimalist shoes, we do have to talk about barefoot running. Okay, barefoot running. This really got popularized by the book Born to Run by Chris McDougall. Now, he based it on a lot of the research by Dr. Lieberman, who is really the proponent of barefoot running and has published a lot in the literature. But this book really took off in the minimalist and barefoot trend. And the theory of this is that if you look at barefoot runners, they tend to forefoot strike. And the thought was that all that cushioning, that heel lift, those gels, those shocks, all those things that the shoe companies did really kind of altered the people's style of running, and it made it unnatural. So you tended to heel strike more because when you're tired, you tend to kind of slow down. And that bottom line, you were designed and born to run without shoes. That shoes alter the natural biomechanics of the running style and therefore can potentially increase lower extremity injuries. This spawned really the generation of minimalist shoes and barefoot running. So the question is, what the heck is a minimalist shoe? And it's still being defined, and there's no research definition for a minimalist shoe, but it's basically anything between a traditional shoe that I just mentioned and being barefoot. And if you could look at the most popular form of minimalist shoe, is the Vibram 5 fingers that really started this barefoot craze. But the industry is really taking off with these minimalist type shoes that doesn't have the little foot things in the front. All right, so minimalist shoes. So how do we define minimalist shoes? So this is just a general definition of minimalist shoes that was reported in the literature, and it just saying usually is zero drop. There is really no midsole or no cushioning inside the shoe itself. They generally have a flexible heel counter or no heel counter at all. For instance, the Nike Fly, that is really one of those shoes that really has no heel counter, and it's kind of designed to be a sock-like feel. There's also no arch support because there's really generally no insole into the shoe itself. And the outsole tends to be pretty flexible and is designed to flex and bend traditionally like a regular foot would while running. Now the question, there's a lot of variations with these type of shoes because anywhere in between could be a traditional or between traditional and barefoot is really a minimalist shoe. But we do think that transition shoes have some cushioning and does have typically about 4 to 8 millimeters of heel to toe differential. So the minimalist shoes is really kind of these minimalist shoes that we mentioned above. The transition shoes, again, it's all variation, but we think that it has a little bit more of heel to toe differential and it has provided some cushioning. The zero drop shoes to 4 millimeters, I would consider minimalist shoes. It's 0 to 4, the heel drop, and the less stuff that is available. So for example, let's take a look at this shoe, one of the Ultras. And the Ultras are branding themselves of all zero drop shoes, but they do have some transitional components with this. So this is a zero drop. As you can see, this is from their website that says the heel and the forefoot are the same distance from the ground. So that the heel to toe differential, if you measure the stack height, will be 0. So this is a zero drop shoe. But as you can see, this is very, very different than the Vibram 5 fingers or even some of the other minimalist shoes like the New Balance Minimus. And the reason for that is look at the stack height. The stack height, if you take the outer plus now they include a midsole, that looks stack height, if you count the little dials on the side, is about 10 millimeters or 1 centimeter total. So this, I would dub this as a transition shoe because it does have some cushioning and it looks like it probably has a heel counter on the end of the heel. And so I would dub this as a transition shoe. Okay, so again, the zero drop shoes, this is zero drop with a transition component with a lot of cushioning to help you transition into zero drop wear. Okay, so the question is, does this work? Does this help? Does changing your shoe give you an advantage and prevent injuries? And we're going to really talk about it. And is it really, to me, is it worth the money, right? I mean, we spend a lot of money on this. And it doesn't make any sense to me. You take out all the fancy stuff like the air, the gel, the shock, the cushioning. You don't even put an insole in, those cheap little plastic flimsy inserts in. You take everything out, you don't even put a heel counter, and then you charge just as much? That's crazy to me. But, that's all marketing. And people will pay for a significant amount to pay for these shoes. All right, let's get back to the case. So we talked a lot about the different shoe types. We talked a lot about what minimalist wear is about and some of the transition shoes. So let's take a look at this 28-year-old with shoe questions. Again, she's interested in your advice on running shoes, and she's interested in running her first 10K. Now, even if you don't run at all, you do probably have to be aware of all these shoes out there and how to counsel your patients who come in with these questions. So as you ask a little bit more history, there's really no medical history. It's benign. She's never had a previous running injury or any leg pain or any hip pain or any ankle pain. She has really no problems with running. You take off her shoes and then you look at her feet, and their exam is pretty unremarkable. You're being a complete physician and you take a look at her knees and her hips and her knee alignment, and you look at their arch, and you find out that all those are pretty unremarkable and she has a normal arch. So what do you do and what do you counsel her with? So before we can go into that, we need to really look into injury prevention and if it is the shoe itself. So let's take a look at the research. So prior to 2007, and we're going to look at just primarily military studies because I think it's more relevant for what we do in practice. New recruits in basic training shoes really depended on the selected shoes depending on their foot type. For instance, if you were flat-footed, you received motion control shoes. If you had a normal arch, you would receive stability shoes. And if you had high arches, you received those cushion shoes like we discussed. But at that time, there really wasn't any research to see if giving recruits shoes based on foot type actually prevented injury. So the Military Training Task Force requested research to figure out, are we doing the right thing for our recruits? Is there a better way? Can we save some money? All those things that they asked. So research was subsequently done both all in the Army, in the Air Force, and the Marine Corps basic training, and to really get to this question. Those who are interested, this is by Joe Knapik et al., and it's a really meta-analysis of all the research that he has done. He is the lead author on all these 3 shoe types studies. So let's take a look. What did we find? So let's take a look at the Army itself. It had over 2,000 men and nearly 1,000 women in their study. So these are big studies. These are not just like rinkety-dink 30 of 30 trials. Okay, so these are big studies. They had the Air Force with nearly 2,000 men and over 700 women. If you look at the Marine Corps, they had over 800 men and nearly 600 women. So these are, again, big studies. So what do? They randomized to either experimental group or to a control group. So the experimental group, they matched the recruit's foot type and shoe to the foot type. So if you're flat-footed, you got a motion control shoe. If you're had high arches, you got a cushion shoe, etc. In the control group, the recruit just received a stability shoe regardless of the foot shape itself. They just get a stability shoe. So what are the results? The fascinating thing is there's no difference in injury incidence. There's no difference in training-related or even overuse-related injury incidents. So basically, this military studies with this meta-analysis in all three studies in the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps really showed no difference in selecting shoe type to the foot type. And these, if you look at the type of shoes that are involved, these were just not your government issue shoe, okay? So this was like your Asics, your Brooks. You can see the Armies, they gave you a choice. So they gave you the biggest choice of all these different types of stability shoes or motion control shoes or cushion shoes to really get to the point of, hey, we really want to make sure that it is designed for the soldier itself. And the control group all got New Balances. The 767 was used in two of the study, and the Air Force uses the New Balance 498s. So you can see that they weren't just regular government-controlled shoes. They were New Balance and all the name brands. Okay, let's take a look at barefoot running. And this is obviously the new craze. And so the question is, what is the benefits of barefoot running, the pros and cons? We have to take a look at barefoot running first, but then we'll look at the minimalist shoes. So, does barefoot running or minimalist shoes prevent injuries? So this is a really nice article that was published last year in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. And if you get a chance to take a look at that, it really summarizes what we know and the evidence and the hypothesis and even future research in the clinical applications of these barefoot shoes studies. So the possible benefits, and they feel like stress fracture of the tibia could potentially benefit from barefoot running. They also mentioned that patellofemoral pain could benefit, and again, that research of plantar fasciitis may show a little bit more benefit than less benefit of barefoot running. The potential harms, like I said, is that stress fractures of the metatarsals, especially as you're running on prolonged mileage, specifically putting forces on that forefoot, can lead to increased stress fractures of the metatarsals. The unknown part is whether it worsens or benefits is the Achilles tendinopathy, and because if you do barefoot run and do forefoot strike, you're putting an increased eccentric load on the Achilles complex, and so we just don't know if that's going to be beneficial or hurt a potential tendinopathy or Achilles tendinitis. All right, now let's take a look at minimalist shoes. And so barefoot running, does it prevent injuries? Obviously the jury's still out. We can think about some of the potential clinical applications. And I think this picture depicts it well. Some of these pictures from Dr. Chris Barton from the UK. He did a great talk about gait retraining. So anyway, specifically, does running in minimalist shoes prevent injury? You know, the hypothesis of barefoot running is that it promotes forefoot striking, which is deemed more natural way of running. So do these shoes do this? And again, we don't know for sure, but we need to understand our trends. I can't go over the kinematics and theories of barefoot running, and frankly, it's too complicated for me with a lot of, never did good physics in medical school or undergraduate. But the bottom line, that barefoot running encourages a forefoot strike, which places the forces across the knee differently than a heel strike. So let's take a look at these pictures. If you look at the picture on the left, this is the center of mass or center of gravity here. That's directly underneath the runner here. Now, when the heel strike here on the treadmill here, the forces will go up the knee this way and up the kinetic chain this way. So as you can see, the theory is that when you heel strike, you put more pressure. You have a little larger dorsiflexion here, a less knee flexion here, and what happens is that you put forces across to the knee and also up to the tibia area. And this also, picture here, also demonstrates that the heel striking can increase the forces up the knee and the tibia, versus the what we call, quote, optimal, if you land on your forefoot or midfoot, that and you land directly underneath, that the forces will go down and up to your axial spine. So let's take a look at more minimalist shoes. So let's take a look at this. So now we looked at barefoot running, but let's take a look at minimalist shoes. So the Vibram Five Fingers, one of the studies were done by Squadron, was done in 2009. So relatively one of the fewer studies that looked at this, older studies. And they basically compared barefoot running to Vibram Five Fingers. And the study basically said the Vibram Five Fingers was able to change the gait to be very similar to barefoot running compared to normal shoes. So if you look at Vibram Five Fingers, that could promote barefoot striking better than traditional shoes would. And then they looked at Bonacci et al. In BJSM, looked at comparing Vibram Five Fingers versus the Nike Freeze. And if you know anything about the Nike Freeze has a varied types, and there's a lot of different types of Nike Freeze. There's Nike Freeze 3.0, there's Nike Freeze 4.0, Nike Freeze 5.0. Bottom line, they used the Nike Freeze 3.0, and they measured their stack height to be about a 4 millimeter heel to toe differential. So they looked at a Vibram Five Fingers, then a Nike Free 3.0 version. And what Bonacci and all found is that the minimalist shoe, such as the barefoot, the Vibram Five Fingers, were definitely different than the Nike Freeze. That the Vibram Five Fingers tended to promote more of the barefoot running style, but the Nike Freeze may or may not. So there were some people who did it, and it may have not prevented it, or not have promoted more of a barefoot style. So the conclusion that Bonacci said was basically says, well, we don't know, but maybe it has something to do with the increased cushioning that these shoes have, and that potentially could alter their running mechanics. So bottom line, the Vibram Five Fingers was more likely to change your gait to barefoot style running, but minimalist shoes such as the Nike Freeze, the 3.0 that they use, which had a 4 millimeter heel to toe differential, did not do it as well. And so what was it? Maybe they thought the authors concluded that maybe it was the cushioning in the shoe itself, that when runners got fatigued, they did tend to heel strike. All right, so now what? We went through all the literature, and that's really all the literature there is so far. I'm sure there's more coming out as we speak, but that's the literature so far. So now what? So basically, bottom line, primum non nocere, right? And Hippocrates said it well. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Oh, maybe he didn't say that. But do no harm. And the question is, what are they trying to do? What are their goals? If they're not having any issues with running, then you may say, well, we don't know enough about it, but here's some general rules, and then I would keep it at that. Then if they're persistent, then if they wanted to try it because it's a new phase, I wouldn't stop them either, and I think that's something, this new trend, you should help promote and support it, and just give them little pros and cons about going in, and just safe running techniques and tips. So here's some of the other things that is recommended. Change your shoes every 400 to 600 miles. And that's really based on very little evidence, and so it's really expert opinion. Experts also said if there was heavy wear, so if you saw some collapse of the midsole, whether it's medially or laterally, that you should potentially change it, no matter what mileage you're at. And then there's another study saying that midsole cushioning naturally degrades after 1 to 2 years, even if you just had it on the shelf. So that's where the recommendation came of change every 6 months came in, but really it's not based on a lot of evidence. One of the pictures here I mentioned here on the right side here, that's the shoe that has the stack height that's brand new, and if you look at the stack height after some mileage, you can see that it looks visibly different, and so you could say that maybe that cushioning is outlasted its use. And so again, if the person is really that runner really wants to try these new fandangled shoes, I wouldn't stop them. I think there's something about having the runner make their decisions, because they're probably going to do it anyway. And so just give them some caveats. I would point to that BJSM article. Just be careful about if you're having pain to stop. You tend to have a little bit more of Achilles type pain a little after you barefoot run for a little while, or use minimalist shoes. So just tell them to transition slowly. And so if you don't have all the time, obviously, there's actually a really good article on the ACSM, and I'm going to point to this here. There's an informational brochure that the ACSM developed. That's the American College of Sports Medicine, on just selecting running shoes. And it's actually really good. It's geared for the lay person and the lay runner, and recreational and even competitive runners, of what to consider in this brochure. So let me digest it for you, just give you the highlights of the ACSM running shoe guide. So they actually recommend a minimal heel-to-toe drop. They recommend 6 millimeters or less of drop of a typical optimal shoe. They also mentioned that it should have no extra components for motion control or stability. It should be pretty neutral. So it shouldn't have all those extra components that cost a lot of money. It should be light in weight, because we do know that weight does contribute to speed. And so they mentioned that a lightweight shoe is important, and anything under 10 ounces is probably a good, 10 to 13 ounces is a good shoe weight size, or weight. And then finally, they also said a wide toe box to help your toes kind of move around like it normally should, and not be all squeezed in the toe box. Okay. They also mentioned that you don't really need to match your shoe to the foot type, because the literature is really pretty against that. And there's also no need to match shoe to a gait. So if you go to a running store and the high school kid that basically got the job last week says, hey, why don't you walk and let me see what shoe that you need, I don't know if I would trust that. Okay, so think about the person you're getting the advice from. And then even if they put you on a fancy treadmill and look at your gait analysis, they said, oh, you need XYZ shoe. Again, there's not a lot of studies that support that evidence, although it's kind of cool to get on a treadmill and take a look at your gait. And I'm raising my hand, I've done that before. Okay. And then they also mentioned to replace the shoes every 350 miles or visibly worn shoes. Again, that's what the ACSM guidance is, and I think that's a relatively good guidance that you can give for shoes. Okay, let's get back to that runner. So that for that runner with wanting to get your shoe advice, I would just talk to her a little bit, and I would just talk to her about this ACSM guidance, and I would say, hey, if you wanted to get new shoes, your shoes look pretty nasty and dirty, and I would maybe consider changing that, and don't trust the advice of the 19-year-old school guy, the high school kid that's talking about shoes, but to look at this as a guide. Just FYI, in the Army they've banned Vibram Five Fingers for running the PT test, so I guess it wasn't Army professional enough. I don't know what it is like the Air Force, but maybe the Air Force has banned it, or the Marines, but the Army has banned Vibram Five Fingers, so take that for what it's worth. For the 28-year-old with patellofemoral knee pain, so again, this is the avid runner. She's had some chronic knee pain, and she's graduated physical therapy, and then she recently started running again. And then when she started running, she had some pain again, similar after 3 miles, and she's training for a Marine Corps marathon. So this is more of a more recreational athlete, but also an athlete that really has a goal set on running the marathon. So how do we support her with her goals? This is not a lecture on patellofemoral knee pain, but we do have to look at the concepts of patellofemoral knee pain. PFPS is a very, very complex topic, and anything in the kinetic chain can predispose to PFPS. So your exam should really focus on the hips, to looking if they have some weak hip adductors, if they're internally rotating their hips, if there are weak hip adductors that are contributing to that kind of that inward valgus knee alignment, and then also the foot pronation, especially if they're flat-footed, they could have some pronation control issues that all inwardly rotates the foot and predispose to patellofemoral pain syndrome. So the first step is to correct these, right? So we all kind of know with physical therapy, this is what they're going to focus on. The weak glutes, the hip internal rotation, the pelvic tilt, the pelvic drops. They're going to work on the hip adductors and to strengthen those, and to hopefully promote less knee valgus, and then maybe even put some custom orthotics or even over-the-counter orthotics for the flat-footedness. However, there's going to be a lot of times, and I know a lot of my patients that says, you know, I've done all this and it still hurts when I run. What else do you have? And before this, you know, when I did my fellowship, that there's a lot of concepts on gait retraining. So let's take a look at this. So this is a picture from Chris Barton. He does a lot of the knee studies, and basically, if you can fix this stuff here, and so this is a pelvic tilt here. You can see her. Their foot's crossing the midline here, that predisposes to more of that valgus knee alignment, and put some extra pressures on the knee. And you can actually fix this. As you can see, this runner was fixed by giving some hip abductor exercises and working on the quad strengthening, the VMO strengthening that we all discussed. And look at her pelvic drop is less, and she's more in line, and she's actually going right of center. Okay, so you can actually fix this, but again, oftentimes it's not enough. And what do you do when you fix a lot of those issues and they're still having pain? And so let's take a look at this Bonacci guy. So remember that Bonacci did that other previous study about how Vibram Five Fingers are more important than the Nike Freeze. But he published this recently too, that shows that barefoot running actually reduced hip adduction, hip internal rotation, and contralateral pelvic drop, which is really all associated with what we talked about in patellofemoral knee pain. And here's interesting that it actually decreased peak patellofemoral joint stress by about 12% versus shod running, or that's, I think, British for running with shoes. Okay. And so if you can look at this picture again, the forces going up the knee if you heel strike versus the forces if you midfoot or forefoot strike goes up the axial spine where it's apparently supposed to go. So how does it impact here's a conclusion from the BMJ editor, said that barefoot running may be utilized as a means to unload the patellofemoral joint as part of a rehab plan, and then maybe considering the shoe prescription may be warranted for those with patellofemoral joint overload. All right, so the question I think came up before, is it the shoes or is it the strike? And so this is another kind of interesting study. So as you can see, you can train anybody to do anything. So look at A. A is a barefoot runner with all these little kinematic tools all strapped up to them, and he was taught to heel strike while barefoot. Then you look at picture B. He's been taught to forefoot strike while barefoot. Then you look at picture C. he's been taught to heel strike with shoes, with the traditional shoes, and that looks like a pretty big heel lift there in that shoe. But then you can also teach this runner to forefoot strike with these gargantuan heel lifts, as you can see in picture D. So is it the shoes or is it the strike? And I'm going to say in the next slide, it's a little bit of both, but it also is more than just the strike. So we're going to touch a little bit about gait retraining. And again, the literature is coming out fast and furious, but this is what we've kind of called down, and just as to think about what we were trying to do with gait retraining. So one of the concepts is increase your cadence. That's a step count. Those are 180 step counts per minute is what you want to look at as what we call an optimal cadence. And what that tends to do is makes your strides shorter, and tends to, I think, makes your strike go underneath your center of mass or center of gravity, like in that picture on the side, on the right-hand side here. The also other concept to do that is also reduce overstride. A lot of runners, when they get tired, will stride forward and lean back, and because they're tired. And so one of the concepts to help with the gait retraining is to take shorter steps, increase your step count, and actually lean a little bit forward. And that's something that can help increase your cardiorespiratory drive, but it'll actually get you less, it'd be a more efficient form of running. And then finally, to promote a forefoot strike, and again, it doesn't really matter the shoe itself. You can actually train people to forefoot strike in their regular shoes. But I got to say, I think if you go barefoot, you'll kind of feel that running on your heels hurts, and you're going to tend to naturally strike forward with forefoot strike or midfoot strike when you're barefoot. And then I would be potential you could start with that and then add the shoes as they see fit. The most common version of gait retraining that we've seen actually reported in the literature is called pose running, and that is a copyrighted program, and that people have to get certified to do this pose running. But the website has a lot of information how to do it, and you pay a lot of money to go to a pose class. Okay, in conclusion, just going back on this slide, so if you're interested in trying to get someone to gait retrain and they have some issues, what I would recommend is there are some physical therapists in our area that would do gait retraining, and so if you have that availability, just talk to your physical therapist and ask them, do you do some gait retraining therapy? And if they do, great. Now that'd be the first line. If they don't, it'd be harder to recommend certain things because there's so many stuff on the internet. But maybe part of this webinar is that we can provide some resources if you guys don't have that physical therapist that potentially you can do. There's lots of great videos out there. One concept was using a jump rope to help you forefoot strike, because if you ever try to jump rope, you're not going to jump rope on your heels. And then when you jump rope and you start running with your jump rope, you're going to naturally forefoot strike. So that's the one concept. I taught my kid to do that. I watched my kid. I videotaped my kid. She's 7 years old. I said jump rope and then jump rope while walking, and basically she's doing a forefoot strike. So that's an easy way to think about it. Okay, so bottom line, shoes really has not shown to prevent any injury. So that's the bottom line. Barefoot running or not running, or shod running. And the role in shoes in secondary prevention is kind of unclear. So primary prevention, we don't know if it does anything because you'd have to have a really large trial. The role of shoes in secondary prevention is kind of unclear, but we may think that it could help with patellofemoral pain syndrome, may help with tibial stress fractures, and maybe even plantar fasciitis. If you look at gait retraining, that's a new concept that some of the physical therapists in our DoD areas are taking care of, can do. But one of the concepts is to forefoot strike, reduce the overstride, and increase your cadence. That's kind of the concepts that we need to really get a handle on, that it's not just the strike of the forefoot or the midfoot or the heel strike, but it's also these other things. Okay, that ends my show here. I'm going to give you some resources here before we answer any questions. So one of the things that we're going to do is give you resources for the provider, and this is HPRC. HPRC is part of the Uniformed Services Universities and the CHAMP, the Consortium for Human and Military Performance, and they have a wealth of information. If you haven't seen this is a DoD program, Center of Excellence for Human Performance. So please go to this site, and we're going to put all the webinar information here, and we're going to have all this area of, hey, if this has knee pain, what do we do, and all the resources for you. And even ask the expert question answer here too.